Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frederick Eriksson, and I have the great pleasure of being the host of today's lunch or afternoon event, or evening event, depending on where you sit in the world. I'm very pleased to be joined by Frank Lavin, who is actually joining us from Singapore. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Frederick. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here today.
So we're going to spend the next hour talking about what is going to come after the United States election. And we're going to do this with Frank. Frank is, as I'm sure most of you know, a long-term friend of ESIPE. He's been doing a lot with us in terms of different sort of speeches and papers. Frank has a long career in business and politics. I wouldn't say that you started, but you certainly had one of your first senior posts in the Reagan administration, where you worked in the White House as the political director. And since then, you've been involved in every Republican administration but one, and that's the current one. You were, if I can call you that, a Clinton Republican, and now you are a Biden Republican, hoping that Joe Biden is going to carry the victory tonight in America. So we're very pleased to have you joining us, Frank.
Thank you, Frederick. I'm glad to be here. My only regret is historically, for the last several years, I think 4 or 5 years, I'd always gone through Brussels at least once a year, and ESIPE hosted for lovely discussion at your offices, and it was great to say hello to everybody in person. And unfortunately, coronavirus means we have to do this all on Zoom, so I regret not being able to visit and say hello in person, but it's still a useful discussion and an opportunity to share some thoughts.
Indeed. And there's going to be a life in a world after coronavirus too. So we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully at some point during next year. So let's start off, Frank, sort of just with a sort of a scene setter on where we are right now. I noticed that Real Clear Politics have sort of the latest poll suggesting that there is a 6 to 7% advantage for Biden in the polls. Do you think, is it safe to say that Biden is going to win this election?
Yeah, I think that's where we end up. I think it's been, although it's been a very colorful year and in some respects an unusual year, the one part of the year which has not been colorful or unusual has been the Biden lead over Trump. And it's over something like 200 public surveys now going back over 6 months that Biden's had a reasonably significant lead over Trump outside the margin of error, as much as 12 points at the beginning of October. That's slipped back a little bit now. It probably is something more like 6 or 7%, and I think that's where we end up.
And if you would look sort of at the counter argument against that, what would you emphasize then? What are sort of basically the opportunities that are there for Trump that pollsters or others may have neglect to not look into, but at least take due account of?
Yeah, Trump could still win. I think it's very unlikely, but it could happen. One, it would require, even if there's a 6 or 7% Biden lead, it would require Biden to lose sort of 8 states with 49% or something like that he loses because of this electoral college mechanism. So that would be one tool that would allow Biden to outperform Trump but still lose. That could happen. Some element of that could happen. And the other theories you hear about are sort of the shy Trump voters or the hidden Trump voters, that because in some quarters at least Trump is disreputable, that people are a bit hesitant to openly express their support for him, so the polling data undercounts the Trump vote. I don't know how you prove or disprove that thesis, but in any event, there are competing theories that argue for Trump victory, but I don't see enormous validity to them. I don't think you could say a Biden victory is a foregone conclusion, but what I think you can say is if the patterns in the next 24 hours are consistent with the patterns we've seen over the last 6 months, then Biden will win.
Yeah, no, that's what seems most likely. I mean, one of the counter arguments I've heard to that particular notion is just not that we may have a repeat of the 2016 development, where a lot of
Sure.
pollsters just sort of underestimated the support for Trump with sort of the shy Trump voters that you were talking about, basically people not responding in polls that were going to vote for Trump. The other argument I have also picked up sort of from news and commentaries, basically that the enthusiasm among voters is much bigger on the Trump side than on the Biden side.
I think both of those points are fair points, but on the first one, there are several reasons why this is a significantly different year than 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton was sort of consistently at 46% or 47%. And if you are the most famous political figure in America, or maybe the world, and you're at 46%, that's a very strong statement that you can't close the sale, that there's some market resistance, there's something about you that people find unappealing. Biden is pretty consistently at 51%. So, it looks like he's okay. So even if every undecided voter goes to Trump, Biden's still okay. So that's one big difference, is that Biden's ceiling, so to speak, seems to be about 51%, and Hillary's ceiling seems to be about 46 or 47%. The second point on enthusiasm, by the way, I think it's definitely true. Trump is a authentic populist, and one element of populism that populism requires is emotional connectivity with an audience. So it's as much about that passion and that personal involvement with the audience, certainly more so than policy pronouncements or ideas or substantive points about where we're going to go next year. But these rallies are sort of events which are imbued with emotion. And Biden just has none of that. Biden is not by naturally an emotional person. He's a very sort of staid person. And he doesn't have that emotional connectivity, right? He can sometimes rise to moments that are inspiring, but in general, he's just not as exciting person. I have trouble, though, taking that point. I think it's a very fair point. I have trouble taking that point and saying it's going to be meaningful in terms of results, because you have a mass election, which is highly publicized, highly motivated, and everybody's voting anyhow. So it's not as if it's an obscure campaign for an obscure office and people don't know the election's tomorrow and they forget to vote, but there's one fellow they get excited about. Then you say, okay, that might help you. So I think it's a fair analytical point, but I have trouble seeing how it provides the Trump people with an outcome. If anything, Frederick, I would say one of the factors analysts, political scientists will conclude when they look at the Trump phenomenon, that if anything, that need for emotional connectivity was as much of a limiting factor for Trump as a strength of Trump, because he's a prisoner of his base. He's a prisoner of his own constituency. He needs that emotional, so he can only speak to his base, and he can only use language that his base likes. So literally people are chanting at these rallies this year. Over the last 30 days, you have people in the crowd chanting from 4 years ago, "Lock her up," which I mean, to my mind, was always a preposterous slogan even 4 years ago, but now it's preposterous and meaningless. And to say, what are you doing in a rally in 2020, still talking about Hillary Clinton and what you don't like about Hillary Clinton? But it just reinforces the fact that the emotional bond in the room is more important than actually a substantive communication. Or to put the question more directly to Mr. Trump, are you capable of reaching outside of your base? Are you capable of speaking to middle America, maybe people who don't have deep feelings about the race, or are neutral between the two candidates? And he has a very hard time doing that.
I noticed yesterday that the new slogan is that you're going to fire Fauci.
Yeah. Fire Fauci was another, but this is, I think this illustrates the point too, that Fauci has, sort of directly or indirectly offered views that are at odds with President Trump's views. And Trump has been, for the most part, sort of light touch in how to respond to that. I think he recognizes Fauci has a considerable public constituency, but the true Trump lover, the true Trump believers are saying, look, Fauci's obviously the enemy. And it's again, it's sort of a silly point at a political rally to be negotiating this point. It's certainly not going to appeal to middle America, but it appeals to the Trump base.
All right, Frank, we're not going to spend so much time talking more about talking about the campaign itself. Just sort of one final question here. So, to what extent is this a referendum on Trump? To what extent are they actually debating core policy issues in this campaign? I mean, is sort of if Trump wins or if Biden wins, will any of them actually sort of move into the White House with a mandate from
Yeah.
the people to do the thing?
I think when you have an incumbent president, the re-election vote is overwhelmingly a referendum on that president. If you are more or less comfortable with Trump, you vote for him, and if you're more or less uncomfortable, you vote against him. So it's overwhelmingly driven by Trump. And the one man who understands that quite clearly is Biden, because Biden made, I think, a very wise strategic view several months ago to play a subdued role, to let Trump sort of dominate, let his enthusiasm out there, because people don't like him. His negatives have been higher than his positives almost since day one. So let Trump be Trump, and that helps Biden. And if Biden had said, no, I want to put forward my 10-point plan on this or 5-point plan on that. I mean, he's done some of that, but have it continue to be a referendum on Trump. What the opponent has to do to be acceptable is just achieve a threshold level of acceptability, that the opponent doesn't represent a level of risk, all right, that he's all right. And Biden, I think, did that competently at the Democratic convention with the selection of Kamala Harris, with his own acceptance speech, with his major public events. He's shown that he's not a radical. He's not culturally hostile to middle America. He doesn't represent the hard left of the Democratic Party. So he is broadly acceptable, although we all know he's left of center, but we know he's an establishment figure.
Yes, indeed. All right, so we're now going to move to a little bit more on policy and talk what we can expect, especially from Biden, but I don't want us only to speak about Biden. I also want to quiz you on what do you think sort of a second-term Trump would do in terms of trade and relations with Europe. And perhaps we should start there, since I think both of us, like most others, are expecting that Biden is going to win, so we can take sort of Trump first and then go into Biden. So a victorious Trump, but what would he sort of bring from the past 4 years from this election campaign in terms of his overall trade policy? Is it that, hitting China, well, you can only win politically if you do that? Aggressive stance on allies as well as others in terms of trade, you're not losing any political support from it. So just continue with what he started 4 years ago.
I think you hit on it, Frederick. My supposition is Trump in general doesn't like trade, or maybe to put it more accurately, Trump sees greater political advantage in being hostile to trade or skeptical of trade than embracing trade. And embracing trade, for the most part, carries some kind of political cost domestically, but being hostile on trade can have some political benefits. So it's seductive for Trump. It's easy for him to be hostile. Now, how that manifests itself, and are there exceptions to the general view, we don't know, because he's already signaled an exception so far in his presidency, which is he would support a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, right? But it's unclear whether both sides can move on that or meaningfully pull it ahead. But that would be a general exception. And let's face it, UK is probably the one market in the world where there'd be a majority American support because of just affinity and level of economic development and so forth. So you wouldn't really cost yourself anything by having a UK free trade agreement. So that might come back to life. The other formal initiative he launched was a free trade discussion with Kenya. So which, on the one hand, I certainly welcome it, I support it, but it doesn't seem to be part of an overall strategy. So we're not quite sure what motivates that or what conclusions we can draw from that. So I wouldn't venture any kind of prediction as to what Trump would do regarding trade. He doesn't have much of an appetite for trade. I will make this prediction, though. Bob Lighthizer resigns as trade representative, and Wilbur Ross resigns as commerce secretary if there's a second Trump term. So Trump gets to reform or reshape his cabinet and start off on a fresh foot.
Why would they resign?
Well, just because they've done this for several years, and it's fatiguing. I think it's and by the way, both of them are professionals, so they won't say this, but I also suggest it's a tough job in general, and working for Trump makes it a particularly tough job. And after you've done it for 3 or 4 years, doing it for 5 years doesn't help you. So you might as well just leave and move on, and go back to your profession or enjoy life or write a book or something. You know, the thing about the U.S. government is I mean, Ross is already quite wealthy. Lighthizer successful, but somebody like Lighthizer could step down from USTR and his salary would go up 3x or 5x, and his workload would go down quite considerably. So at some point you say, well, why not do? I've done it for 3 or 4 years, so now I'm going to go back to my law firm or do something else.
And I suppose, you know, perhaps doing something with Kenya and possibly with the UK, even if I think a lot of Brits have mistaken themselves in thinking sort of that with Trump in the White House, they have an ally that is going to help them to deliver a trade agreement. But it's sort of, if you take these sort of initiatives aside, I would imagine sort of that a second term Trump would become even more aggressive in terms of hitting China, doing, you know, disrupting trade with, you know, Europe, possibly Canada. You know, perhaps, I mean, he needs, in order to fire up his base and give some essence to his own language, he needs to go on Mexico again and NAFTA.
Oh, but look, that's one theory, is Trump does like friction. He likes turmoil. He always likes a fight. So let's have more fights. That's definitely part of his motivation. I'll tell you the counter argument is something like this: Trump must be the hero of the story, right? Trump has to have some kind of resolution or success that he can point to. And he's not the hero of the China story. He's not really much a hero of the NAFTA story either. So he doesn't really have much to point to. So the point is, maybe trade issues have a greater cost and not much of a benefit if you start putting all this friction in there. So I think he might have lost his appetite. I cite this: he came into office, if we go back 4 years, he had 2 key issues he ran on 4 years ago as a candidate. One is build a wall on the Mexican border, and the second one is repeal Obama's healthcare plan, Obamacare. And he was more or less unsuccessful at both of these, and he's more or less abandoned both of these. And I think you said these are good sort of rally themes. They're good, exciting talking points, but he didn't have the patience and the discipline to actually get these implemented, and so he walked away from it. I wouldn't be surprised if he views trade in the same capacity, to say, you know, I enjoy a fight. It makes me look good, but I don't enjoy a fight if I don't win. So he could very well go either way on trade. I wouldn't make a prediction.
All right, very good. Let's talk President Biden and what to expect from there. And before we go into it, let me also invite participants in this meeting to fire off questions. You can do that most easily in the chat function if you have questions you want me to raise to Frank. And we're going to have sort of an opportunity towards the end of this hour for more questions, but don't wait until then. Fire off the questions right away, and I can also pick them up while we're talking if that fits well.
Good.
All right. President Biden, what is his mandate? What does it take away from this campaign if he steps into the White House in terms of his overall trade policy?
Well, there are several somewhat, I wouldn't quite call them contradictory impulses, but they're competing impulses that he brings. He is an internationalist. He is a multilateralist. He believes in the international system, and that it's worth it, that the United States, for most of the modern era, has been the steward or the champion of international architecture, and it's been to the benefit of the United States. And so that, in that sense, Biden is much more consistent with traditional U.S. foreign policy of the last 80 years or so. So that's sort of, I would call that the positive impulse. There's an important negative impulse as well, which is to say that in the Democratic Party constituencies, organized labor is regularly unenthusiastic or opposed to trade initiatives. And Biden is very sensitive to organized labor. So that's sort of on the negative side. But there are still other factors. For example, Um, One interesting aspect of Trump being so hostile to trade is that American public opinion has moved in favor of trade over the last few years. So if you look at the Gallup polls about is trade a cost to the U.S. economy or does it help the U.S. economy, overwhelming 79% or something of Americans say it helps the U.S. economy. So the public mood has shifted to be pro-trade, in part driven by Trump. And I'll give you a fourth element that I think shapes his worldview. The most significant trade issue that was poised for ratification when Trump took office was TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Trump pulled out of it. Trump said we're out of it, even though we were one of the parties that helped launch it. So that's an Obama administration initiative. So Biden has parentage over that initiative. Biden has ownership for that initiative. Now, so Biden, I think, is in a position to relaunch or reinvent or recast that initiative if he so chooses. It's still an open question, but he has an opening there. The point is, any good Democrat, regardless of how they feel on trade, has to at least start by accepting that this was a worthy initiative and it was Obama's idea, and all good Democrats must support it. So he's got more flexibility on that initiative than other initiatives. So what we don't look, I think the enemy on this, so to speak, the anti-trade party, so to speak, are not protectionist, but it's opportunity cost. Meaning his real challenge for his first 3 months or first 6 months are going to be, how do you establish your presidency and define your presidency? And there's only 3 or 4 issues you can deal with, and maybe trade is issue number 5. But so it's not that he's opposed to trade. It's just to say, look, getting economic recovery, keeping that on track is absolutely vital, and coronavirus is absolutely vital. And that's what the first 6 months of my presidency are about. And I'm not going to do anything except those 2 domestic activities, right? So that wouldn't surprise me either. But he's got finite management bandwidth.
And I suppose there are a couple of issues that are urgent, but they may not be that important, that is going to end up on his desk, like, for instance, a new election of Director General to the World Trade Organization, for instance, since America's blocked that one. But sort of looking at more sort of issues that may not be urgent, but they are really, really important politically: relationship to China, trade frictions with China.
Right.
What would be the instinct of President Biden there?
Well, I can offer a general comment because I've had some discussions with some Biden's foreign policy team. But my point, and I think they're 100% on board this, is, look, you spend the first 3 to 6 months reaching out to your friends and your allies and your natural partners and re-establishing, redefining what historically have been very positive relationships, which in the view of the Biden team, and I think a lot of people, have atrophied or been damaged even under Trump. So you spend your first 3 to 6 months, not necessarily with a strategic policy goal in mind, but just say with important communications, diplomatic relationship goal in mind. So I said, for the first 6 months, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, the National Security Advisor, the Vice President, the President, they all just have to get out and cover territory and get around and be good friends, be good listeners, good interlocutors, talk about plans for next year, and remind other countries what they like about the United States, why we're typically viewed as a worthy partner and a preferred partner for international initiatives. So you need to rekindle that warmth over the next few months. But that doesn't directly answer your question about what's the strategic goal.
So rekindling old friendships, I mean, you're talking mostly about Europe here, right?
Well, Japan, Australia, I mean, treaty allies, Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, I'm so sorry. But there's a lot of treaty allies out there, and there's a lot of international architecture out there as well. So it's not purely political military alliances. No, yeah. I would cover territory. I think the United States has been underperforming diplomatically, has been too interested in friction, not a good listener, and I think you just need to reposition the brand, so to speak, as a good partner.
And using that as a segue into a discussion on relationship with Europe, I've seen some commentary in Asia suggesting that there are some older allies of America who fear that Biden would be more of a Atlanticist than someone who takes a strong interest in the Pacific and relationships around the Pacific, while President Obama obviously put a lot of effort into trying to build, for instance, what you mentioned with the TPP. Some of them fear that Biden is far more interested in Europe and it is going to neglect quite a lot of what's going on sort of around the Pacific. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say the United States needs to get its game up internationally, and it's not, regardless of region. We need to be doing more in Europe. We need to be doing more in Asia. So it's not a question of withdrawing resources from one geographical area and reallocating them. We need to have a better footprint in Europe. And I'd also say it's a bit of a challenge or a bit of an opportunity for Europe as well, if I may say so, Frederick, because you get these resets reasonably rarely, and there has been deterioration in the last few years. So there's an opportunity. Biden is very much an Atlanticist. He's the fellow who would go to the Munich security conferences quite religiously, right? So he is quite comfortable dealing with European leadership and ministerials and knows a lot of them personally and is a good interlocutor. So there's a lot of strength in that relationship. But I'd say don't make the mistake of interpreting a evolution from Trump to Biden as sort of a goal in itself. I'd say it's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. That now the conversation is on a better footing. Now there's greater willingness in Washington to engage. Now there's an appetite for trying to actually improve the relationship. But let's come up with some specific initiatives that would take us to the next level of a relationship. And let's not make the mistake of saying, oh, we're having friendlier discussions. I guess our work is done, right? Because then we've wasted the moment. But I'd say there's a honeymoon period and there's a fair amount of goodwill. So let's capitalize on this goodwill, whether it's a free trade initiative or other kind of initiatives, regulatory initiatives, mutual recognition initiatives, something in the tech space. But the world's getting smaller, and we've got to look at ways for EU and US to harmonize, both for the efficiencies, the economic efficiencies that would generate, but also as a means for sort of trying to set formally or informally setting global standards that will help other countries move towards rule-based behavior as well.
And you think President Biden would be interested in that, in sort of taking a pretty bold initiative with Europe?
Well, by the way, I think philosophically, absolutely be interested. The main argument against is my point of a minute ago, the opportunity cost, to say, am I really going to make my administration all about a free trade agreement in Europe? But I'll tell you what I would do if I were Biden. I would say I'm spending the first 3 to 6 months of this administration taking soundings in European capitals and in Brussels about what is the EU appetite, what are the various nation state appetite for doing something meaningful. We had a proposal, I think, about 18 months ago, 24 months ago, from the German auto manufacturers. What about a sectoral 0% free trade in autos, right? And then somebody else, which, that's a really intriguing idea. That somebody else said, well, look, let's broaden that to all manufactured goods. So that's an intriguing idea as well. By the way, if we're doing it in autos, we're doing it in manufacturing goods, yeah, no question, agriculture is very, very sensitive. But, you've got some building blocks there for a free trade agreement. So maybe he's got the appetite to do it. Do you have the sense that Europe has the appetite?
Well, I think it's difficult to answer it because, under Trump, it's just become impossible to weigh up different alternatives in doing things with America. I mean, what I would say is that, the sort of commentary and viewpoints that you get from capitals around Europe is that, if a few years ago people would say, we tried TTIP, it failed, let's not try that again. There is an appetite to consider what other options could be in terms of doing things with America, to resolve bilateral frictions, but more importantly, so try to sort of establish a new framework for doing things globally and affecting change globally. So I think there is an opportunity there.
I would definitely endorse that, and I suspect the Biden administration would endorse that as well. But I also see both these themes as parallel and mutually reinforcing, meaning the more we harmonize economically or in other sense between North America and Europe, the easier it is then to jointly collaborate on external projects as well. And it could be coronavirus, it could be international tourism, it could be e-health or e-education initiatives. So there are a lot of areas where we just have greater weight, greater mass, and it'd be enormous. So I mean, you could have a U.S. EU initiative for secondary schools. Let's make sure that every single country in Africa, all 54 countries in Africa, have an online free secondary school tuition program in their native language, right? And this is going to be, and it wouldn't be enormously expensive to do, but you get US and you're all of a sudden you're just upgrading the human capital and opportunity of that entire continent, right? So you could have initiatives like that would be enormously helpful and a good area for US and Europe to collaborate.
Yeah, no, indeed. But just a follow-up question here, Frank. So President Biden comes in and looking sort of at relationships with Europe on trade. There are quite a number of frictions here. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the big one is on all the Airbus Boeing cases
Sure.
from the World Trade Organization, where
Sure.
America has introduced tariffs as compensation for the support that European governments gave to Airbus, and now Europe has an opportunity to impose tariffs on US exports because the WTO has just confirmed the award to the EU. And then we have all the other issues. I mean, going back to the steel and aluminium tariff. So, it's what do you do as an incoming president? I mean, do you want to sort of clear the table from old frictions, or do you want
but let me make a philosophical point. If you don't have a philosophy or a strategy of managing what's good, then you're left with managing what's bad. Meaning, if you don't have an affirmative agenda saying, here's what we're doing to solve problems, to reduce tariffs, to improve trade, then you're just left adjudicating disputes and you've got nothing but bad news. So that's kind of where we are. There's no affirmative agenda. There's no vision. There's no program in place to actually improve the trade relationships. So we're reduced to writing speeding tickets and saying you broke the speed limit and here's a speeding ticket. And then somebody disputes that. And then we go to, and they write a speeding ticket for us. And you say, that's not trade policy. That's just sort of an odd dispute ping pong game. So what I would say in the first instance, get on the front foot. The best way to beat bad news is to develop good news. Let's define the relationship positively. Let's define the relationship aspirationally. Let's hold out some kind of vision of some improved outcome. It might take us 3 years or 5 years to get there. But what's interesting is once you articulate that and you get buy-in on that, then all of a sudden these quarrels fade significantly because everybody realizes the economic value of every one of these disputes is not even 1% of the economic value of actually a free trade agreement or some other kind of improvement in overall architecture. So let's put our resources, our energy into improving trade, and let's not put our resources into writing speeding tickets.
Yeah, but I mean, to offer sort of a point of criticism against that view, Frank, isn't what you're saying basically that, Biden is willing to go on, sort of a global apology tour, making amends for sort of America's mistakes over the last 4 years? Wouldn't he sort of be interested to at least use some of the friction that Trump has created in order to get something in return for it?
Yes, yeah. By the way, I do agree with that, and I didn't mean to suggest that he should dogmatically reject Trump, but I do think in terms of tone and Trump's appetite for friction, I would say that was overwhelmingly not helpful. And I would just try to establish a different tone or different demeanor. But I think you're right that in some respects, the friction might have been helpful or might have been useful in sending signals. Sometimes it wasn't necessarily attached to a strategy, but at least it served a communication device. And look, I think the jury's still out. I know most of my European friends might not agree with me, but I find myself open to say, did the Obama outreach to Iran work? Was that the path? Was Iran performing better internationally because of that outreach? And therefore Trump's rejection and reversal on Iran was a mistake? Or would you say there's no real evidence that what Obama had done had improved Iran's behavior on critical issues such as its nuclear program or support for international terrorism? Therefore, Trump's reversal was the right move. So, I mean, I hope to your point, if I were advising President Biden, I'd say don't dogmatically undo what Trump did with Iran. You might want to say to the Iranian foreign minister, my Secretary of State will meet you in Zurich in 6 months to discuss this matter, right? So you're not undoing what's been done, but you're saying I'm open to hear ideas from Iran. But I remain skeptical of Iran's intentions, I guess. If you believe that their intentions are benign and they really just want to join the family of nations, then I think you should have some engagement strategy. But it's interesting to me that Trump took that strategy of engagement with North Korea and got nothing out of it. But then he went the other way with Iran, a very hostile approach to Iran. But I think it gave the Gulf states some confidence that they could look at U.S. as a trusted partner, and the Gulf states felt more comfortable about extending diplomatic relations to Israel. So there were some benefits in that tough stance towards Iran, but there didn't seem to be any benefits in the engagement strategy toward Korea.
Yeah. One of the issues that we, of course, also watching very closely from Europe, because we basically have a similar problem as America, is United States policy towards China. And there's a follow-up question here from one in the audience saying that policy towards China seems to command greater bipartisan support than most other areas of US economic diplomacy. What would change under a Biden administration, given the reality of ongoing technological rivalry?
Yeah, it's really striking to me. You know, I work in China, although I have not, because of coronavirus, I haven't been able to visit for most of this year. But for quite a while, I'd spend 1 week a month in Shanghai. So, you know, I have a reasonable background in China, I think. But it is striking to me the very sharp deterioration of views toward China in the United States over the last 12, 24 months. And you're absolutely right, it's bipartisan. So across the ideological spectrum, enormous antipathy. Trade is a part of that. Trade friction is a part of that. Geopolitics is part of it. You know, China's been in this, had friction with its neighbors at different times, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with India famously over the last year. A lot of quarrels with Australia, putting the Canadians in jail. So there's been a fair amount of friction, a fair amount of differences. But it's a low point in the modern era, certainly since formal re-engagement started under Nixon and Kissinger. In the last 50 years, this is the worst I've seen it, and it's bipartisan. Look, some of these issues are pretty complicated issues, so you're not going to necessarily solve them, but I think at least Biden, I think, would be a better interlocutor in the sense that he wouldn't seek he wouldn't seek to make criticism of China a domestic political issue in the United States that Trump does, right? And my advice to the Biden team is, look, you need to practice statecraft. You need to find areas of convergence where there are areas of mutual benefit, and trade and finance is frequently reflects those areas. And then you need to find areas where you have to negotiate and fix problems. And there's a fair amount of trade issues you want to fix as well. And then you have to be able to draw a line under core interest. And those are things like freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, or U.S. support for Taiwan, where we underline we have our core national interest as well. I would also add that the status quo, to my mind, is enormously beneficial to China. So my comment to friends in Beijing would be, let's think through the cost or think through the benefit of any attempt to change the status quo. In what ways would a territorial claim in the South China Sea benefit China? In what ways would it hurt China? And my point is, I think it diminishes China's security more than it enhances China's security, right? And that for China's security, for its own well-being, it needs to be able to develop some kind of stable relationship with its neighbors, where there's mutual respect, territorial integrity, rule of law, and that international architecture is the best long-term guarantee of China's security, rather than a few hundred meters of territory in India or some other assertion of power. I think that arguably hurts China more than it helps.
Yep, no, indeed. Another issue which is also close to the heart of many people in Europe is the World Trade Organization and efforts to try to revive the relevance and perhaps even the integrity of the Geneva trade body.
Right.
My expectation would be, as you said initially, Frank, that Biden, being sort of a strong internationalist, a multilateralist, he would like to basically take away all the problems or all the positions that we've seen coming from the United States on appointments of appellate body judges. Not sort of take them away entirely, but at least take them away to the point that you can appoint members of the appellate body again, that you can appoint a new director general of the WTO, and use that sort of as an opportunity to see if there is a greater willingness on the part of the membership to also reform the system more thoroughly than that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think, look, I think all of this friction brought about by the United States has just caused an enormous amount of ill will out of proportion to whatever value the nominal issue was, and the appellate body being one of those. And I think it's related to my previous point. If you don't have an affirmative trade agenda, then you're not trying to improve trade. All you can do is litigate bad news. And that's what the Trump administration is doing in the WTO. But if you actually were trying to push something or promote something ahead and improve something, then we'd focus all our energies on that. So I think the cost benefit for the United States of picking and finding these appellate judges is way out of whack. Even if I'm sympathetic substantively to some of the U.S. points, but I think cost benefit isn't lined up, and we're defining ourselves as an obstructionist party, which is not where you want to be in these international bodies. So I think you're going to find a far more collegial person in the Biden administration, but I can't give you a name of who might be USTR. But the one name I've heard, well, I don't want to mention names. I don't want to mention names. Or I might kill the person's chances. So
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back then to the in-tray from Europe for President Biden. So it's not that we have some of these frictions where I think you can justifiably say that they have been created more by America than by Europe. Steel and aluminium tariffs, for instance, national security, the national security argument for introducing tariffs against, well, not just Europe, but other allies as well.
Right.
But we also have a lot of things coming out from Europe that may not sort of be very positive for President Biden. So we have, different things going on in technology, digital policy in Europe that.
Well, the tech issues, and I would also say the tax issues have a anti-US bias to them. The tech issues definitely do. So there's a look. Both of these economies have this internal competition between economic rationalism and economic nationalism, and you see nationalism dominate occasionally in Europe, and the tech issues is a good example, and the tax issues as well. So my hope would be that we focus on economic rationalism, on market economics, on growth, and on reducing barriers rather than trying to elbow the other party for some nominal advantage.
Yeah, but how do you do that? I mean, I suppose.
Can I just build on your question though, because you made an interesting point to say, look, if Biden comes in, there will be a moment of goodwill, and by a moment I mean it could be a year or two. And my point to your friends in Brussels and in Europe is, don't waste the moment. Take advantage of goodwill and an appetite for some kind of progress to put forward a menu, put forward a few items where there is an appetite, and realize that in the first 3 to 6 months, the Secretary of State or other senior dignitaries are going to be running through some of the capitals of Europe and saying, what's on your mind and how can we take the relationship ahead? And you don't want to just say, boy, that last fellow was such a nuisance and he really stiffed us on the appellate body at the WTO, and thank God you're being more reasonable. That's a waste of that year. So let's come up with something we could actually do. So I would say let's start that conversation today in Europe as to where is the appetite for improving the relationships, lowering tariffs, regulatory recognition, other kind of initiatives that could be taken that would allow the two economies to work more closely together. Or, as you mentioned, are there joint initiatives that can be undertaken vis-a-vis third areas that would be beneficial as well. But this is a moment where there's going to be goodwill in Europe and in the United States, and let's capitalize on this goodwill.
And from your vantage point, do you see that goodwill in Europe as well, that there is an appetite?
Well,
on
I'm
the
saying
part of Europe?
I think there'll be relief of the departure of Trump. I think some of these people were very, very trying to work with, and there just seemed to be gratuitous friction. So I think there'll be relief, but I'm saying don't make the mistake of just fixating on that relief and saying, oh, the nuisance is gone, we're back to good relations. To say, well, wait a second, we've got a lot of problems here. We've got to improve the trade relations. We do have these set of tech issues. How do we're looking at a global economy, global political architecture. How do we improve coordination so we're not just seduced by the fact that Donald Trump's not around anymore and we think we're actually have improved our relations?
Yeah. And I imagine sort of some of these issues are going to be more thorny than others. I mean, just to bring up two, one is, and to bring in sort of another country into our discussion, Frank, Russia, where sort of we don't just sort of have a sort of strange relationships politically, economically, diplomatically, in that sort of theology of three other countries, with Russia on the one hand, United States and the European Union on the other hand. We also have issues like, for instance, a second Nord Stream pipeline, where you've seen campaigns in the US Congress of actually introducing sanctions on companies that are participating in building that second Nord Stream pipeline. So that's one issue where I think tensions are going to be pretty strong, I would imagine. And where I'm not so sure that a President Biden or a Biden administration would make sort of a radically different appreciation of what's going on here than a Trump administration. Let's start with that one. So,
yeah, this is an interesting point because I mentioned Iran a few minutes ago as a place where there's a sharp difference between Trump and Obama. Russia might be another country where there's a very sharp difference, that there was, even though Obama began with a very accommodating policy, not too different from Trump's, by the end of the Obama administration, it was quite frosty. There was an enormous amount of unhappiness with Putin. And Putin had already gone into Crimea, had already gone into Eastern Ukraine, and there are other problems with Putin. So, and then that got reversed under Trump. I think Biden, in some respects, sees the Obama administration and his time there of somewhat of a victim, if you will, or on the receiving end of criticism from Russia. So I think he has more of an appetite for pushing back against Russia because of that history. But he has not articulated a strategy or a plan or what he hopes to do, but he certainly has more of an appetite for that. I don't know where Europe stands on this set of issues now, or what proposals Biden might make to Europe. But it looks to me also that Putin runs a risk of being, tactically very adept, but strategically foolish. He's tactically adept in terms of dominating a moment or dominating a dispute and sort of prevailing or having his way. But you say strategically, how did that help you? You've wasted a decade. You've wasted a decade when you could have focused on economic growth and economic integration and playing a leadership role in Europe. Then instead, you've created all of this friction with your neighbors, and you've never moved your economy into the modern era. You've never moved your economy beyond natural resources. So, it's a real opportunity cost for Putin as well. So. I have trouble understanding how he views his role in this, but I think Biden will be sounding out European leaders on Russia policy, as you suggest, when he starts visiting Europe next year.
Another question which comes from several participants here concerns relationship with Turkey, also an ally country. Where, of course, the frictions between Turkey and Europe has increased quite a lot with the migration situation, and now, of course, also around sort of the reactions from President Erdogan in relation to Emmanuel Macron and French positions on Islamism. I mean, more broadly, what is sort of the American role here in when it comes to sort of the Turkey and Turkey's own strategic thinking about where its future lies.
Right. Well, look, I think U.S. Orientation is going to be overwhelmingly on the Macron side of this, if you will, right? I mean, its weight is overwhelmingly with the European. I think the U.S. relationship with Turkey has also been unnecessarily friction-filled and contentious over the last few years as well. From Erdogan's purchase of Soviet military equipment, which was quite an unusual move for a NATO member, to the series of disputes over natural gas off Cyprus, and stepping up naval patrols viewed as unnecessary, to his interventions in Syria viewed as unnecessary. So there were several steps that looked inconsistent with behavior of an ally and just caused friction. And then there's concerns about Erdogan shifting away from Turkish historical positions domestically about injecting religion back into the public space and reversing secularization society and things that it might not be part of foreign policy consideration, but it's not viewed as a positive step. So all of that comes into play. But I don't think Biden has articulated a specific set of goals beyond that, except that Erdogan has done a lot to degrade relationships both with the U.S. and with Europe over his tenure. And I think the most common response you hear in Washington is we're looking forward to him leaving the stage, and we hope that some of the opposition parties' gains in local election is seen reflected at the national level.
Yep. I've also received a lot of questions related to your comment on a US-UK free trade agreement. And you mentioned this initially, that this has been part, sort of one of few sort of positive initiatives by the Trump administration. Now, this is an issue which is, I mean, it also carries sort of a high degree of symbolism, both in the UK and around Europe as well, since I think a lot of people in the UK have built sort of the relationship with America as a substitute to a relationship with Europe, that in the views of some perhaps over-intoxicated Brexiteers, they thought that you could substitute the volumes of trade that you have with Europe with the volumes of trade that you have with America. The Johnson administration in the UK has sort of, at least initially, thought of itself as being sort of that fantastic bridge into Trump administration. So with the Biden presidency, do you think that the UK-US trade agreement is dead, or do you think he's willing to sort of put some efforts behind that?
I don't think it's dead, but it's very hard to judge where it would stand, because the worst moment to evaluate a trade policy is in the middle of a presidential campaign, Frederick. I mean, because it still carries with it negative emotions, and Biden wisely has not articulated trade goals. He did notably have an essay in Foreign Affairs, the leading U.S. foreign policy journal, earlier this year, in which he did say, you need to move ahead on trade. You do need a trade policy. So he did, to his credit, he did come out for trade. He didn't take it into specifics. So that's all we know. That's all we know. And if you look at any of Trump's rally speeches, Trump says Joe Biden supported NAFTA, which destroyed millions of jobs. He supported China's entry into the WTO, which destroyed millions of jobs. He supports giving your jobs overseas. He supports this destruction of the U.S. economy. So he's got this sort of populist labor messaging. By the way, I don't think it's terribly effective, but the point is, don't bolster that line of criticism by coming out for trade. So it behooves Biden quite wisely to just keep silent on these points. And then he has to define for himself, what will he do? Will he do TPP? He could. Will he do a US-UK? He could do that. Will he go to the EU and say, let's go for the big game? He could do all of that, but we just don't have a sense of his appetite. And as I mentioned, the main counter argument is simply opportunity cost, that it requires enormous administration commitment to do this. And is that really an appropriate priority for the first 6 or 12 months?
I suppose behind that question, if he's going to put his weight behind an Anglo-Saxon free trade deal is sort of there's an underlying assumption sort of that in terms of his outlook on Europe, President Biden will give priority to Berlin and Paris and Brussels, and London is not coming high up that list. So sort of there is at least sort of an expectation out there that that Biden is going to be a lot more interested in building relationship with continental Europe than with
here's
UK.
what's very interesting. Looking, we know Angela Merkel is in her final moments of chancellor, federal chancellor. I mean, not final weeks, but there's going to be a transition in Germany. But Macron is incumbent. What's interesting to me, if we look at Johnson, Merkel, and Macron, we might say this might be the first time in the modern era where an American from sort of American political culture might feel that Germany or France is a better interlocutor in terms of the personalities of the leaders than the UK prime minister. So historically, the Americans felt very, very familiar, very comfortable with a Tony Blair or Harold Macmillan, Anthony Eden. I mean, these were people they all sort of knew and instantly responded to. And there weren't, you could feel that way about maybe Helmut Schmidt. I mean, there were sometimes in Germany it would hit that mark, but sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes in France, even if you really respected Charles de Gaulle, I wouldn't necessarily say you felt cozy or comfortable with him. So he was respected for his life success, but there wasn't necessarily a connectivity with the U.S. on that. So, but with Macron is a rationalist, right? Merkel's always a rationalist. Boris Johnson is a bit of the outlier in this circle. So it's interesting that this would be the first time. If you ask Biden, who do you want to have lunch with? I think he's more likely to say Merkel or Macron than Johnson, right? If you ask Trump, who do you want to have lunch with? He'd say, well, Johnson is who I want to have lunch with, right? And so it's an interesting sort of socio-cultural point. I think it's a very unusual moment in leadership personalities.
Yep, no, indeed. I have two more questions before we're going to end, Frank.
All right.
The first one is, I mentioned previously two issues that may be very sensitive from a European point of view, and where there actually may be actions coming from Europe, which is going to hit America also in trade. And that is about climate change and whether a Biden presidency is going to sign the Paris Agreement and basically sort of, get into fold. Perhaps not so much on the actual policies, but at least in terms of the overarching framework for global cooperation on the climate. Do you think he's going to sign up to it?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind he will. That's an easy yes for him. There's an important constituency here. And remember, there's no enforcement clause in the Paris Accords, and there's no performance requirements. So they're all targets and so forth. But this plays, I think, very much to Biden's personal orientation, and it plays to important faction in his political group as well. So I think this is I would very comfortable making that prediction.
And would that also come with a sort of more of an active legislative program in America as well, in terms of pursuing policies?
By the way, he has an appetite for that. He has an appetite for that, but also some conflicts on that. Meaning, I think he has a lot of green instincts. So he has a green orientation, and he knows, so to speak, that over time you have to move beyond fossil fuels and support alternative energy. So philosophically, he's sympathetic to that. But he also knows that the traditional energy industry in the United States is very important economically for the United States. I think it's possible to do both. I think it's possible to be green oriented, be a green, but without being masochistic, without being self-destructive or imposing a kind of punitive cost on your own economy. So, I mean, what you start with is the carrot side. You start by saying, let's have more tax credits and government support for alternative energy, right? And let's have regulations that support alternative energies, and let's let small firms and institutions come in with alternative energy needs use. So let's just foster as much as we can on that side of things, right? And that's a good start. Then do you want to actually be punitive on the traditional industries? The one comment he made in the course of the campaign, he made at the last debate, is that he would end fracking on federal lands. So he wouldn't ban fracking, but he would end it on federal national land. So so he's got some appetite for moving against traditional industry, but it's modest.
All right. Finally, Frank, I don't know if I told you, but you've actually just been appointed as an advisor to Chancellor Merkel, and she wants to have a 5-page memo from you about what should Europe do now with a Biden presidency coming in. We've already touched upon it, but again, what would be your key bullet points in a memo to Merkel or Macron, or for that matter, to Brussels?
I think you'd have 2 or 3 baskets. I think you'd have a trade basket to say, let's understand what appetite there is in Europe for liberalizing on trade and how far we're willing to go. That'd be 1. I think 2, the Wehrkunde, the Munich Security, enhanced Pall-Mill coordination, because I think to your point, even if people aren't comfortable with working with Trump, I think you had a very fair point to say many European nations aren't hitting their 2%. How do we keep going down that path of enhancing security in Europe and improving NATO outcomes? So security basket. And 3, what you alluded to a few minutes ago, out of area cooperation. How do we, the future of transatlantic relations is not going to be internal or insular, it's going to be external. And what are we doing in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America, in East Asia, so forth? How do we collaborate better in these out of area markets? But those would be the 3 baskets I'd want the federal chancellor to touch on.
Frank, it's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Great. Wonderful. I hope to see you in Brussels soon, Frederick. That's back to Maison de Cygne for Mou Provençal. That's what we need. That's what we need.
And until then, may I just sort of finally compliment you on your choice of literature on your bookshelves behind that yellow book.
We always take a survey in our household of what are the most favorite books, and we always put them on the bookshelf out of respect for the audience, right? And we've got enormous support for the current array of books.
Yep. So, and for those of you who didn't understand that joke, there's a yellow book behind there who has my name on the book cover. So, anyway, Frank, it's been a great pleasure having you here.
Good. This is a great Christmas gift, everybody. Good. Thank you, Frederick. Thanks so much for having me on. Thanks, everybody, for your questions. And I hope to see you in Brussels, or when you come out to Asia, look me up in Singapore, please.
All right. And thanks to all of you who have joined this fascinating conversation. I'm sure we're going to return to issues around America and Europe very soon again. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon.
Good night.